Florida versus Utah. It's game week, week one. Week zero's in the books. We sort of got our appetizer this past weekend with a handful of games, and then this week it kicks off for real. 5 days of games in a row: Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And I'm going to be live streaming all 5 days. I'll be live streaming Thursday night for the Florida Utah game, which I'm going to talk about now. I'll be live streaming Friday night games. I'm going to be live streaming pretty much all day Saturday. Sunday night for LSU, Florida State, and then Monday night for Clemson and Duke. But let's talk about this Florida-Utah game. I think the first interesting game of the season, really. There was, like I said, a handful of games this past weekend, but nothing really that jumped out at you. This Florida versus Utah game is interesting to me. Utah ranked around 15-ish in most people's preseason rankings. Florida unranked in the majority of rankings, or unranked in the AP and the coaches. A few individual rankings or polls have them cracking the top 25. An interesting matchup for a lot of different reasons. We saw this game last year played in Gainesville, where Florida won a close one. Last year, it seemed to be pretty split down the middle to me in terms of who people were picking to win out of Florida and Utah. A lot of people considered Utah to be the better team. It was first year under Billy Napier. Didn't really know what to expect. One of the big advantages Florida had last year, when you look at the lead up to that game, was, of course, home field. Exact opposite this year with the game being played in Utah. And a big deal, particularly because this is Florida's first. This is an unbelievable stat, by the way, but this is the first time Florida has played a non-conference Power 5 opponent on the road in 30 years. 30 years. I'm not talking about neutral site games. Every time I make that comment, I get somebody that shows up in the comments section that wants to tell me about some bowl game Florida played in somewhere, or some neutral site kickoff classic game they played somewhere. Those are not road games. Those are neutral site games. There are home games, there are neutral site games, and there are road games. This is the first time Florida has played a Power 5 non-conference opponent outside the state of Florida in 30 years. They play Florida State every year, but that obviously is in-state, right? First time they played a Power 5 non-con opponent outside the state of Florida in a true road game, 30 years. On the road at Syracuse in, I believe, 1991, and they lost. So Florida's got to travel a long way to play this game. We'll see how it shapes up. My thoughts on the game: like last year, I feel like Utah is the better team. Now, obviously, Florida won the game last year, but I feel like Utah is the better team again this season heading into the year. There are some question marks surrounding Utah quarterback Cam Rising and whether or not he will play. And if he does play, how close to 100% will he be? Well, Utah put out a depth chart a couple of days ago for this week, and they've got Cam Rising listed as QB1. You have to kind of approach this game, I think, in two different ways, especially if you're considering betting on the game. Utah's a 6.5-point favorite. I would not bet on this game. I wouldn't bet Utah at minus 6.5 unless I was very comfortable that Cam Rising was actually going to play well, be able to run around, be mobile, all that. And I don't know that. Therefore, I will not be betting Utah minus 6.5 in this game. If you have inside information or a gut feeling or whatever, and you just really believe Cam Rising is going to be 100%, then go ahead and take Utah and lay to 6.5. I do think Utah will win this game. New quarterback for Florida, Graham Mertz, completely reworked offensive line. Now the running backs are back. So it's an odd situation for Florida offensively. The best part about Florida's offense last year was its ground game, its running game. We all know the struggles Anthony Richardson had throwing the ball. And yes, he ended up being a top 5 pick in the draft, and it looks like he's going to start in the NFL. We'll see how that pans out. But regardless of how well or poorly Anthony Richardson plays in the NFL, he was not a good thrower of the football in college. Now, he was extremely dynamic. He could run around. He could make a ton of plays with his legs. He had a rocket for an arm. I mean, all those things are true. But he couldn't throw the ball. So in comes Graham Mertz. I actually think Graham Mertz is a better passer of the football, at least from college level-wise, than what Anthony Richardson was. However, he does not give you anywhere near the explosive ability that Anthony Richardson did. He's not nearly the athlete. He's not nearly as mobile, as fast. He's nowhere near as big of a threat to take off running as what Anthony Richardson was. Florida's offensive line being totally reworked. Strength of the team last year was running the ball. Brand new offensive line. Even if it ends up being a pretty good offensive line, I don't think it's going to be as good of an offensive line overall as it was last year. And they certainly don't have the chemistry, at least early in the year, that Florida's offensive line had last year. It was full of returning starters. The running backs will be good. Out at wide receiver, Ricky Pearsall is still a good wide receiver. Young and inexperienced players to go alongside him. Doesn't mean they won't be good eventually, or they won't even be good this week. It just means we don't know that for certain. It's hard for me to imagine that Florida's offense is going to have a whole lot of success on the road in this game against Utah. Utah, on the other hand, a totally different team at home than they are on the road. If you're an SEC type of guy, a fan of an SEC team, and you don't keep up with much outside of that, think about Alabama. Now, obviously, Utah's nowhere near as talented as Alabama, but what I mean is Alabama has struggled on the road the last couple of years and been almost a different team at home, right? Utah's similar to that. You can look at Utah's record, especially against ranked opponents, at home versus on the road, and it's drastically different. They're a much better team at home. This crowd will be electric. It'll be sold out. This will be close to an SEC environment. Now, Florida playing in the SEC, playing in a lot of hostile environments every single season, week in and week out in the SEC, I don't think Florida's going to show up and be intimidated by the crowd any more so than they are on a week-to-week basis playing in the SEC. But nevertheless, that will energize Utah to have that home crowd behind them. So it may not necessarily be a disadvantage to Florida that they're playing in front of a hostile crowd because they're used to it, but it will be an advantage for Utah that they're not playing in front of a hostile crowd, which they're not used to doing in the Big 12, and they had to do it last year at the Swamp. They get the comfort of their home confines for this game. Even if Cam Rising is unable to play, I would still take Utah in this game. I think Utah has enough returning experience and talent along the offensive line, the running back room. I like the tight end situation, even though they lost Kincaid. I like the other guy, Braith, is that his name? He's really good too. And Utah's defense is legit. Utah's lines of scrimmage are legit. I think this is going to be a good matchup. Utah's offensive line against Florida's defensive line. Talked a lot about Florida's offense. Florida's defense, I think, is going to be pretty good and take a significant step forward from what we saw last year. They're really big along the defensive line. I have some questions about their linebackers and how they may perform over the course of the season, and I like their secondary. But Utah's offensive line against Florida's defensive line is going to be a really good matchup to me because Utah's offensive line is really, really good, and so is their defensive line. Utah's a physical team. I know we think of the Pac-12 when we think of like Southern Cal or UCLA or maybe some of these teams that aren't necessarily considered to be all that physical. But Washington, Oregon, Utah, these are physical teams in the Pac-12. I'm not trying to compare them to the SEC, so calm down with that. But they're physical lines of scrimmage. Even without Cam Rising, home field advantage. Utah's defense, to me, Utah's defense as a whole has a clear advantage over Florida's offense as a whole. I think Florida's going to have a hard time moving the ball consistently down the field against Utah. And like I said, because Graham Mertz lacks the big play ability that they got from Anthony Richardson, I think in order to score, you're looking at a bunch of long, drawn-out, methodical drives for Florida. And I just don't think they're going to have a whole lot of success doing that against this Utah defense, particularly in a home game for Utah. I like Utah to win this game relatively close with or without Cam Rising. I do think Cam Rising the Cam Rising factor can't be understated. He plays hero ball. He reminds me of Max Duggan from TCU last year, right? If the game is on the line, you want Cam Rising quarterback in your team, just like you did Max Duggan last year. It just seems like if you need a touchdown in the last 2 minutes of the game, he's going to get you one. If you remember the game last year, this thing came down to the end. Utah scored at the end, but Florida got the ball back, went down and scored. Utah actually got the ball back again. A crazy ending. Florida hangs on and wins by one score. I could see this one going similarly to that game with Utah coming out on top in this one. Number one, because I just think they're a more experienced team. I think they're a slightly more talented team. I think they're a better coached team and home environment. I think those four factors are going to lead to a close Utah win here. If you want some type of score prediction, I'd be looking for something in the neighborhood of Utah 27 or 28, 20 or 30 maybe. Utah somewhere 27 to 30 points. Florida, anywhere from 17 to 23 points in there. Somewhere between like a 6 and a 10-point win for Utah. The line is 6.5. Like I said, because of the Cam Rising uncertainty, I wouldn't lay the 6.5 with Utah. Although I do think they win the game. And boy, poor Sunbelt Billy. How many game losing streak is he going to be on now? He lost a bowl game. He lost to Florida State. Hell, I can't remember the last time Sunbelt Billy lost a game. Oh well. Give me Utah to beat Florida Thursday night at 8 o'clock. I'll be live streaming about 7:45. I'll see you there.